We have International Women's Day coming up, and so I wanted to share a couple of thoughts. The first thing to say is, if you're wondering, do I talk about International Men's Day? I do. I speak at International Men's Days, at events on International Men's Day as well, because for me, the freedom of one is embedded in the freedom of all. So one of the things I was thinking about was, what is the most helpful thing that might help women? And coming up to International Women's Day. So the first thing to say is, about 2 years ago, I decided to stop speaking on International Women's Day for organisations that weren't doing active efforts for gender equity and inclusion in the organisation, and were only kind of getting speakers for the publicity. So this year, I'm only speaking with either companies that have directly worked with me or companies that I know have done significant work. And what it means is, it means that I do less, okay? But what it actually really means is that when I speak, I know it's not tokenistic, and I know that people are genuinely having a positive impact, and that this is genuine celebration of efforts rather than kind of the cupcake celebration while there's nothing behind it. So anyway, that's one thing. So one of the things that I thought would be helpful is Inclusive Leadership Navigating Organisational Complexity, the book. It was based on the idea that your identity has an impact on leadership. And a lot of the time, there's leadership books that are written generically, and it assumes that everybody's identity would interact with the recommendations the same way. Inclusive Leadership Navigating Organisational Complexity is written on the assumption that actually all identities interact differently. And so there are some things that would help different groups and different identity groups. And one of the things I think is good to talk about is what inclusive leadership isn't, because lots of people get confused, and it can kind of help specifically women leading up to this International Women's Day. So one thing is, it's not about being nice or PC. We can be all these things and still not be facilitating belonging or valuing uniqueness, which is the definition of inclusion. Belonging without uniqueness ends up in assimilation. Uniqueness without belonging ends up in overly individualistic and kind of using people. Knowing everything about diversity, labels and needs, this leads to listening less, more stereotyping, and a fear of making mistakes. So what can sometimes happen, because women are often facing the competency bias, which is the prove it bias, that women are assumed to have to prove that they are capable, then sometimes it would be really unnatural to not try and be the expert on everything you talk about. And in inclusive leadership, it's not about being the expert. It's about helping people come together and make good decisions. Never making a mistake, which we know impacts women more than other identity groups. Mistakes are part of inclusion and inclusive leadership. It's a skill of repairing that we need to develop. Mistakes are part of leading. Senior leadership's sole responsibility is that everyone's responsibility is to facilitate inclusion and inclusive leadership, whether privileged or marginalised, senior or junior. So this idea that leaders or individuals should be solely responsible for it, and I would say that goes across lots of different topics. And we know that female leaders may often take on more responsibility than their counterparts with different identities, because they've been socialised to take more responsibility. Lots of invisible labour. It's a tick box exercise, so sometimes people just talk about it and say they're doing it without really being able to answer or give examples of it. It is not just a variant of servant leadership or other leadership approaches. Inclusive leadership is the utilising of inclusion in order to lead. And we know that when women use social power, that they are not breaking the gender stereotype, and it's considered a strength. And so engaging with inclusive leadership as a way of engaging with social power is really helpful. It is not the opposite to rejection. Including people is not the same as not rejecting people. You cannot include people and also not reject them. It is not the same as having the intention to be inclusive. It's the impact of inclusion. So going out and saying I'm inclusive because I mean to be is not the same as actually having that impact. And so from the book, they're my little offerings as we come towards International Women's Day, and we're about to see a load of posts about it, a load of celebrations, a load of people monopolising it. But if you are a female leader or you want to support female leaders, then some of those points I've made can really support levelling the playing field, and still the focus is on being effective and being an effective leader. It's not on being a woman leader, it's actually on being a leader who happens to be a woman. And that's one of the main things that I talk about in the UCD Professional Academy diploma in Women in Leadership. Is there's a difference between women in leadership being a subcategory of leadership, where the central idea of leadership is ultimately white, male, middle class, able-bodied, versus being a group of leaders who have unmet needs. So when I talk about women in leadership, I'm not talking about women in leadership in comparison to men in leadership. I'm talking about women in leadership as an underserved group of leaders who have their own way of doing things, which are as diverse as everything else, And I'm not talking about it as a subcategory of being a man in leadership. And what I mean by that is there's loads of articles which says 6 female leaders' opinions on X, Y, and Z. And they never say 6 male leaders' opinions on X, Y, and Z. That's how we know it's being presented as a subcategory. Because if we don't need to mention the gender in other articles, why do we need to mention the gender in this article? And the only time we should mention the gender or the difference or the reason, like women in leadership, is when we're specifically saying we're meeting an unmet need. So when I say women in leadership have these needs, instead of me saying leaders have these needs, do I say men have these needs? And unless I'm going to call out all identities when I'm having conversations, I'm going to keep unconsciously centering men as the norm for leadership. And so I will leave that with you to ponder. Hopefully that's helpful. Hopefully the points give you something to think about. And I'd love to hear if you've read it or you've utilised some of the points from the book. Let me know in the comments or DM me directly. Thank you.